seen as a viable route, powerful tool for justice and human rights. Is this still the case? As Maytham asked, how do we make it work better? So this is the question we're going to ask. And with us are Aya Maizub, a researcher from Human Rights Watch, Brian Dooley, Senior Advisor of Human Rights First, and Devin Kenny, researcher at Amnesty International. Let's welcome them. Let's welcome them. Yes, from looking up from your laptops, that's how we're going to welcome people. So let's get engaged. Okay.
Put it, yeah.
Okay, we ready to go? This is why I will never have my own show, because it takes so long to get prepared. Maybe I should move over here.
Yeah, move on over.
I think, yeah, close it up a bit. Just a question for all of you. The Human Rights Council has issued several statements in the last 8 years calling on Bahrain to end the deterioration of human rights in their country. But as we've heard and we've seen on the videos and talked about this morning, this is not the case. In this specific context, what actions do you think the international community should be taking to tackle this situation?
Well, so as has been pointed out already, is this working? I feel like
Yep.
my voice is louder than normal. Yeah, very good. As has been pointed out already, Bahrain's just been elected to the Human Rights Council. So just as far as symbolism, at least, that's a pretty inappropriate position for it to be in. It's not the only human rights abuser on the council, unfortunately, but it's certainly one with a record bad enough that would merit it not having been elected in the first place. So as far as symbolic and to some extent practical action that can be sought as a sort of maximum strategic goal, trying to see it removed from the council, which I believe can happen by majority vote in the UN, would send quite a strong message, and taking a somewhat lower tactical bar or a less maximalist goal. At a minimum, it's written into the resolution which governs the Human Rights Council's work that members of the council are expected to be under a particular level of scrutiny during the duration of their membership on the council. This means they go through the UPR process, but also just in general, that they can and should be held to a higher bar, or at least a higher level of attention to what's happening with their domestic human rights record. So that's pretty obvious and low-hanging fruit for international organizations to work with in terms of trying to get the council to implement its own mandate and look at the record of its own members.
Interesting. Aya.
So the Human Rights Council is a microcosm of politics on the global stage. So the same power politics that...
Is it on? Is it on? Your mic on?
Oh, I think it's off. It should be. Oh, well, is there any...
Hello? No?
No.
Okay. Maybe Brian, you could you respond and I can repair work?
Excuse me for coughing all the time. Yeah, look, I think that there is more to international pressure, thankfully, than the Human Rights Council, which is useful in a limited way, but deeply flawed. And I think wholesale reform towards a Human Rights Council which is pure and only has countries in it which respect human rights is unlikely to happen. I think it matters when the Human Rights Council does and says things, but as we've seen, not just in Bahrain, but in many countries, over many years, that in itself doesn't change things. I think if you look at there may be more, but I can think of 4 or 5 international initiatives over the last 7 or 8 years on Bahrain. The big ones really haven't come from the Human Rights Council. I mean, the US and to some degree the UK pushed for the Bassiouni Commission. The US brought a case against Bahrain under a free trade agreement on human rights. The Swiss did for a while take the lead at the UN, and then bilaterally it tried to do some stuff. But those things sort of worked temporarily, but after an initial burst of push and enthusiasm, they petered out really. I think the Bahraini government has learned that it just needs to pretend that it's interested for a little while, but then if it delays and stalls long enough, then whether it's the American government or the Swiss or anybody else, then eventually enthusiasm will wane and they don't really need to do anything about that. I mean, the Bassiouni Commission report is the best example of that, where because of international pressure, the Bahraini ruling family was pushed into commissioning a report which was very critical of what it had done its government had done in 2011, and it promised to make all sorts of recommendations, which it didn't do, and it didn't have to really because the initial burst of enthusiasm and pressure waned. So it just had to run out the clock and wait for the rest of the world to lose interest. I think that's happened in a couple of the last UPRs too. So I think international pressure can work. I think where it hasn't really worked over a sustained period is that there's been a short burst of attention, and then the Bahrainis just wait and wait and wait and delay and stall, and let's wait another 6 months and let's wait 12 months, and by that time things have moved on. There's a new administration in the US, governments in Europe change, and then they're sort of off the hook because they just delayed it into oblivion.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Yes.
There you go.
So what I was trying to say earlier is the Human Rights Council is a microcosm of politics on the global stage. The same power politics that plays out in the international sphere also plays out at the Human Rights Council. So unfortunately, in arenas like this, power and money trump human rights concerns. So it's always up to human rights defenders from Bahrain and up to us to make sure that the issue of Bahrain is being brought up. And we had a lot of success between 2012 and 2015 when there were 5 joint statements on the issue of Bahrain. All of these joint statements were led by Switzerland and signed by all the EU member states as well as the US. The problem we're seeing now, however, is that Switzerland is not, it seems to have lost the interest in taking the lead on Bahrain, and we haven't been able to find another state that's willing to take the lead. If there were to be a joint statement on Bahrain, and if there were to be a country that was willing to be the penholder to take the lead, then there would be a lot of support. And a lot of countries, I think all the EU member states are very likely to sign such a joint statement. The problem is finding that one state who's willing to take this initiative. And in a lot of other contexts, very small states have been willing to take the initiative. So for example, New Zealand has taken on the case of Cambodia, and it's now the penholder on initiatives at the Human Rights Council on Cambodia. Similarly, Iceland has taken on the Philippines. So I think it's up to us to try to do some advocacy, try to find a state that's willing to stand with the human rights defenders in Bahrain and willing to take the lead, now that, unfortunately, Switzerland has relinquished that role.
Aya, you know, what Brian was just saying, that this has kind of happened before, where you've seen countries kind of commit to Bahrain and say, you know, we're champion Bahrain. And the issue is that it peters out, that it's not sustainable. In these campaigns that you're talking about, or these partnerships, is there any discussion about longevity or kind of sustainability of that relationship, or anything that addresses that kind of issue?
Unfortunately not. I mean, the joint statements are just statements that are read by a bunch of, that are signed on by many states and read, and they address human rights concerns and then call on Bahrain to take some, to make some reforms. They're non-binding, however. And so all 5 of the joint statements that we've seen have called on Bahrain to do, exactly the same things. They've called on Bahrain to release political prisoners, stop torture, implement the Basuni Commission's recommendations, hold officers responsible for torture to account. All 5 of the statements have said exactly the same thing. However, Bahrain hasn't implemented any of those recommendations. So usually joint statements, they're useful if they either lead to an easing up on the ground or lead to then a resolution at the Human Rights Council on Bahrain. Unfortunately, the joint statements on Bahrain have led to neither.
Okay. Devin, you talked about holding them accountable, the members on the council, to their kind of promises of supporting and promoting human rights within their context, and that's not happening. And that international organizations should use that as a kind of target that as low-hanging fruit. Have you seen an example where that's worked?
Where a state's been ejected from the council or has received particular scrutiny due to its position on the council? I mean, I think to some extent we had that with Saudi Arabia when it was a council member. I'm not sure if its term has ended. The human rights community's approach to the council has been somewhat different than it was towards the old UN Human Rights Commission, which was the predecessor organization, because eventually that body had such a record of bringing on board states with obviously just abysmal human rights records that it began to lose credibility, and the human rights community has to walk a somewhat fine line on this in terms of, on the one hand, trying to hold this new institution, the council, to its mandate, but not trash it to the point that it's simply seen as non-credible as an institution, which aligns with sort of anti-UN agendas that are generally not in line with at least Amnesty International's position, and I don't think are in line with very many human rights orgs' positions at all. So yeah, it's somewhat tricky. And I guess to answer your question more directly, in the recent past, I can't think of a specific case which is a resounding success story, but it seems worth pursuing the option.
But not a reason to not do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems that we have the policy and quasi-legal tools in terms of the council's existing mandate and the resolution framing it to pursue this in language that they're bound by.
So I'm just going to ask, and rather than wait till the end, is there someone who would like to just comment on what our panelists have talked about right now? Want to add any perspective onto any of these issues? Yes, Joe. Joe, can we have the microphone here? Thank you. It's here. Michael's coming. Thank you.
Yeah, just in answer to that question, I think the only case I'm aware of where a country was expelled from the council was Libya in 2011, when, of course, Libya was pretty widely unpopular in the winter, spring of 2011, and there was sort of a crowdfunding action going on in the UN, in the council. The other area, though, has to do with the election of states, and there, again, the illustrations are extremely limited, but I think the one pertinent one is this, Russia, which lost the vote to have a seat on the council in 2016, maybe 15. It was the result of the Crimea invasion, annexation. But the key thing there was procedurally there was an election, and as we know, part of the problem is that states, including in the MENA region and the Arab League states in particular, they set up a block. There's no competition for the seats.
Great point. Anybody else? Sorry? Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know, just to add on a procedural point to what Joe said, it is worth understanding about the council that of necessity, as a UN body, they need to have representation from all the regions of the world. And unfortunately, in MENA, we're sort of starved for standard bearers for human rights. So there's always going to be MENA states on the council, and we should be aware that simply getting rid of Bahrain, we don't want to eject Bahrain to put in another state that's as bad or worse on the council.
Good point.
Yeah. Actually, this is me again. I had to be representing the UN. Actually, my background is a civic society activist, but I believe with the existent mechanisms, this is what we have and what we need to use. And I just want to highlight that the new commissioner, the new human rights commissioner, is coming from political background. And she is fully aware about the dynamics of the politicians and the politics within, it's not only in MENA region, in different areas, and how they affect human rights and putting it as a priority or not in certain topics and in certain countries, in certain context. So, but this is like really a good thing. Is like there is like instruction that we need to put the political context as a background when we are going to negotiate any kind of intervention from the Human Rights Council within countries. And it's very difficult actually, because we are looking at two sides. Whether we want to be engaged in a country, at what level we can engage. And we know there are so many human rights violations intentionally against human rights defenders, and so many groups are not enjoying the rights. But at the same time, could we ignore that, or be saying that, no, we will not touch that country because there are so much right violations? This is really a very critical point when we decide how we can engage with the country. So we prefer to also work on the how we provide the technical support on how to use these mechanisms, the reporting, dealing with the Human Rights Council. That's one issue. The other issue is like, now we know, and it's like, I don't know, decades ago, when the UN system realized the importance of the civic society to be a guardian for human rights in certain countries. And also because, the duty barriers, those the state, they do not really fulfill their commitment. So the civic space is become now, even with this new plan for or working plan strategy for the Human Rights Council and OHCHR in specific, is to highlight a shift for civic space, increasing the civic space, and focusing on that. In this regard, the new commissioner created internally, this is an internal mechanism, to create a task force just to look at that specific area where it noticed that the civic space is shrinking, and particularly in MENA region. So, we are aware as a Office of a Human Rights Commission, and but this is like the responsibility of the civic society itself to interact with the human rights mechanisms, to report more and more.
Right.
Of course, with do no harm principle.
So what you're saying really is to engage people, but also have the tools to help them to know how to navigate those mechanisms.
Yes, of course.
Okay.
In the MENA region, we see the less than the other regions, when we cannot see more interaction from the civic society. For instance,
No, so I'm just gonna cut you off at this point, because we're going to move on to the next question. But that was a great intervention. I think reinforces what some of our colleagues here have started to talk about. We heard earlier, and we all know, that the Trump administration has canceled the ban on F-16 fighter jets that was established by the Obama administration, in spite of the ongoing human rights situation in Bahrain. And I'm just wondering, I mean, it's kind of an obvious, but what do you think are the ramifications, the implications, not just immediately, but kind of maybe a bit longer term to that decision?
Well, it's worth noting that at the moment, the Bahraini government isn't using high-grade military hardware to repress its own population. They have a minor role in the Yemen war, and the F-16s might be of concern there. But this raises maybe a larger strategic question that we should take into consideration, which is that all our advocacy tends to be directed towards a fairly narrow span of actors. I would basically say the Western countries and the UN human rights bureaucracy. And so even supposing hypothetically that we got those bodies to do everything that we wanted to, would it actually change the situation in Bahrain? To be honest, I'm somewhat skeptical. I think it's worth pushing for anyway, because it's always worth pushing any actor to withdraw its support from negative actions. But the main thing Bahrain does now is arrest people and deny them right to due process and abuse them in interrogation and prison. The technology involved in that is not F-16s. It's technology that they could get from literally any country in the world or simply make themselves. Requires metal bars, a car battery to torture someone. So the F-16 issue is significant. It's worth focusing on. And over the long term, it could have horrible ramifications if Bahrain ever entered into a situation as bad as other countries in the region have, where the government was actually using high-grade military hardware against its own population. But I just want to throw it out there for all of our consideration, my own included, that we tend to focus on this narrow core of countries where public opinion is sensitive to these issues. But the underlying structural issues, I think, within Bahrain won't be changed from outside. They can only be changed by action within Bahrain, by citizens claiming their own rights and essentially forcing the government to respect them.
That's very interesting, very interesting. Yeah, it's actually the first time I said that, heard that, in the sense that in some ways, do you think it might be a distraction, looking at that big picture and not supporting more?
It depends on the audience.
Yeah.
I mean, for international actors, I suppose it is appropriate. We all have to consider where we can be effective and how. And an organization like Amnesty, which I represent, we are most effective and our audience is most centered in public opinion, historically within the Western countries, more so within the Middle East. Today, but definitely historically our core public opinion audience has been in the Western countries and those governments. So again, it's not necessarily an inappropriate target, but for Bahrainis within Bahrain, yes, it may be a distraction to consider that if the F-16 deal has happened, that things are going to change. I rather doubt they would, at least not from one day to the next.
Interesting. Oh, yeah.
I mean, I completely take your point about F-16s not being used in the current repression in Bahrain, but I think the lifting of human rights concerns from big arms deals by the US to Bahrain sends a very clear signal that they don't care about human rights in Bahrain. I mean, in the past year, the State Department has approved the sale of 5 major weapons sales to Bahrain. I mean, sure, these particular items might not be being used in the ongoing repression, but it's a clear sign for all Bahraini human rights defenders that the United States Trump administration is not on your side when they're conducting business as usual with a country that's repressing its own people, torturing dissidents, denying them due process. I mean, I think that that has very big ramifications even internally, and it sends a message both to Bahraini human rights defenders that they can't look to the US for support, but it also sends a message to the Bahraini authorities that they can continue repressing their people and they can continue torturing people, and the United States will shrug and conduct business as usual. So I think that we should focus a lot of our advocacy on investigating which countries are selling weapons to Bahrain, and where possible, try to pressure them to withhold those arms sales as a way of leverage. It's one of the only ways of leverage that these countries have over Bahrain. So I think it is our role to try to use these big arms sales to ask countries like the UK and the US to attach human rights conditions to big weapons sales.
Interesting. Brian?
I think that the US government shrugging about human rights violations in Bahrain didn't start with the Trump administration, and I think it's overstating it to suggest that things were sort of all right under Obama and now they're not. You know, it was Congress that stepped in at the end of 2011 and stopped the big arms sale proposed by the Obama administration to Bahrain. And then there was a ban put in on selling arms to Bahrain, both to the military and to the Ministry of Interior, and it was the Obama administration which then lifted the ban on selling weapons to Bahrain's military, citing imaginary human rights reforms. In fact, the ban on selling weapons to Bahrain's police, to the Ministry of Interior, is still intact. So things are worse than they were a couple of years ago, but it's not like things were okay a couple of years ago either. And I think Congress, where the US has done the right thing, it's largely been down to Congress rather than either the Trump or the Obama administration. And you know, as much as you're looking for small pockets of hope on what might be achieved, I think that there is perhaps something emerging there with the US Congress, in that the murder of Khashoggi really has changed the equation, and I'm not sure that we know quite how yet. But I think that it's possible that Bahrain will fall into the menu of things that Congress is happy and eager to fight with the White House about. Clearly about MBS, clearly about Yemen. Now, if we can stretch that conversation into what about Bahrain, what about Egypt, I think that's possible. So I think there is some hope there that Congress might renew its interest on Bahrain, partly because there are political points for it to score against the administration, which may turn out to our advantage. I think also in other countries, it's not just about the Human Rights Council, it's not just about the White House. I think it's about the US Congress too is a powerful player, and I think that other countries' parliaments should probably also get more of our attention than they have. Either parliaments as whole parliaments or individual MPs. I think that there is some sympathy for what we're trying to do among individual parliamentarians and among the European Parliament, some of the other parliaments. And I think it would probably be a good idea for us to redirect some of our attention on those in the coming year or two.
This is a window, like it said, it's a window of opportunity. And again, we don't know how long that'll last, and maybe that is the time in terms of campaigning ideas and focusing our work. You think that would be worth?
I mean, the Washington scene is the one I know best, but for the first time really in a generation, questions are being asked which haven't been before because of the murder of Khashoggi, right? How come the US is allied with these guys? Can you believe the horrific human rights violations that are? Well, yeah, we can, because we've been telling them. But that's like a fashionable conversation in Washington now, which it hasn't been for some time. And meanwhile, then you've got the administration, Pompeo, and the others really doing a sort of a 1970s Cold War type approach, where anybody who is against Iran is on our side, and that's okay. In the old days, it was anyone who's against the Soviet Union is on our side, and therefore okay. Right. And back in those days, it was Congress that overrode some of that nonsense. One of the first things I worked on was the apartheid issue in South Africa. And the Reagan administration wanted to carry on business as normal, politically supporting the apartheid regime, and it was Congress that overcame that. So possibly you see some sort of division shaping up like that Congress in the US and parliaments in other countries might be more productive for us to try and lobby.
Is there anyone who would like to add in on? Yes. And let's keep this germane to this issue as, you know, it's, okay, thank you.
يوسف ربيع من البحرين. طبعا أريد التنبيه إلى أن حكومة البحرين تستخدم شركات العلاقات العامة في التفلت من
Does everyone have translation? Everybody? Yes, I know. Yeah, I'm just asking if anyone. Okay, go ahead.
في التفلت من المساءلة الدولية والتخلص من الضغوط التي يمكن أن يقوم بها المجتمع الدولي. طبعا هذا يحدث في دول متعددة سواء في أمريكا أو حتى في يعني أوروبا، وبالتالي تدفع حكومة البحرين مبالغ طائلة في هذا الجانب. يعني عشان نكون دقيقين أكثر وواضحين، هناك إحباط لدى كثير من البحرينيين من مواقف المجتمع الدولي تجاه الحكومة البحرينية. طبعا القمع في البحرين يمكن أن تشاهده العين وتسمع عنه الأذن وتنقله شاشات التلفاز في يعني التي تريد أن تنقله. أنا أعتقد أن يعني ما تفضل به سيد إبراهيم بأن الحماس قد يعني يكون موجود ولكنه يقل. لدينا مشكلة في فهم الإدارات يعني الضاغطة على حكومة البحرين، وخلني أحدد هذه الإدارات. هي الإدارة الأمريكية والإدارة البريطانية. ثمة مصالح كبرى تدور لهذه الحكومات. أنا أعتقد أن على مؤسسات المجتمع المدني في أمريكا وبريطانيا والدول الأخرى المناصرة لحقوق الإنسان أن تضغط على طبعا القوى النافذة في داخل المجتمع الأمريكي أو البريطاني أو الأوروبي من أجل إيقاف هذا القمع. الآن في البحرين يتم ملاحقة المدافعين، وأيضا يتم اصطياد القيادات السياسية ووضعها في السجون. وأعتقد أن الشيخ علي سلمان هو الأكثر شخصية الذي يطالب بالحوار والتسامح، الآن مودع في السجن بجريمة خطيرة جدا في عرف القانون البحريني، هي التخابر مع حكومة قطر. وبالمناسبة الولايات المتحدة شريك فيما كان يعرف يعني في هذا الأمر. بالتالي أنا أعتقد أن في مسؤولية أخلاقية، مسؤولية إنسانية على المجتمع الدولي، عليه أن ينفك شوي من المصالح الاستراتيجية، المصالح السياسية اللي إليه في منطقة الخليج وتحديدا في البحرين. شكرا.
Thank you. Anyone else? Khalid?
Thank you. Devin is talking about the change that is coming from inside. And I mentioned statements that never developed resolutions. And I'm talking about the failure of us as civil society to cooperate, to have a strategy about Bahrain. Like, it's very important to have a unified strategy to know who's doing what. So far, there's a failure. We failed to stop arming Bahrain. This is very important. Still, Bahrain is getting the most sophisticated software and hardware from Western companies, and we failed to stop that cooperation. And they are using all that cooperation to target online activism. People don't have any way to express their ways, just the social media outlets, and still all these networks are closely monitored by the government of Bahrain. So I think that the organizations that are heavily involved in Bahrain, they need to talk to each other. We never have had successful meetings in which we could write a strategy, how we could cooperate, how we could stop arming Bahrain, how we could stop the cooperation between the government of Bahrain and the software and hardware companies, and also to have a strategy about those detained vendors. They have families, they have a lot of problems.
Right.
So I hope that this will encourage us to talk to each other first. Thank you.
Thank you, Khalid. I mean, after following this, these discussions this afternoon, we're going to take some time to kind of look at what are the ways that we could actually perhaps coordinate issues together? We could, come up with strategies based on, the current situation in Bahrain, that we can actually see some impact. Maybe rethink how we're doing things now, because I think that's the challenge I'm hearing here, is that things aren't working as well. It's not as easy as, we've never thought it was easy, but it's more difficult now. And how civil society keeps coming up. Civil society has to become more active and more engaged. Well, how are we going to do that and make it effective? Joe.
Thank you. I want to throw out a question chiefly to Devin and Brian. It seems to me there should be much more focus relative to the US, UK, on the UK. Bad as the US is, and it's pretty bad, the UK, in my view, diplomatically, is much, much worse. Mm-hmm. And you have this curious phenomenon, the fact that in London and in the UK generally, there is a pound for pound more Bahraini, the exiled population is relatively large. They're very active. There's been a parliamentary interest in this question for going back decades, and yet, there's been from what I can see, and from the days when I used to meet with FCO people, they simply, they're impermeable. I'm very puzzled by the fact that, in London in particular, where there's more Bahraini reformist activity, opposition to the government, opposition to UK policies than any place else on earth, I think, frankly, except Manama, that the needle has moved not at all. And I'll bet you, just in reference to a point Devin made earlier, that in the Human Rights Council, if there were a joint statement, if the EU were to sign on to it, if the UK were to be part of it, it would only have to be after strenuous negotiation, which the UK has basically watered down the contents of the resolution, so it becomes close to meaningless.
Yeah, I tend to agree, or I fully agree. I was reviewing the rhetoric of the US and the UK prior to this conference, and yeah, the UK is diplomatically shameless. It's already been noted a few times today that the reaction to the New Year's Eve verdict against Rajab was just to say we're concerned, which is about as weak and limp as it gets diplomatically. They didn't criticize anyone, they didn't say that any violations of law or of rights had happened, and they didn't even call for his release. Whereas if you look at the US position on both Rajab and Sheikh Ali Salman, the position is to call for their release without qualification and regardless of the fact that they've been convicted in Bahraini courts, which, if you want to get down to it, that's the same position basically as Amnesty International's and Human Rights Watch's. So in the US case, it's not so much a matter of changing the position as they formulated in words, it's a matter of making their policies match the words that they've already said. In the UK case, there's a notable lack of shame even in their rhetoric, and that definitely deserves attention. I don't think the alliance with the Bahraini government would be particularly palatable to the British public if they were surveyed on it. So the fact that this isn't more of a salient issue in UK politics, or that there isn't a higher level of political shame around politicians in the UK defending Bahrain or refusing to lift a finger to condemn it, is surprising and concerning and merits work for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and it's a mystery to me why the UK is so very bad. The other thing I think, which is slightly different maybe, and maybe to do with the colonial legacy, is that in the UK, in Parliament, Bahrain is much more often, in fact nearly always, lumped together with Saudi. So when the UK has parliamentary hearings on Bahrain, it's on Saudi and Bahrain, which may actually now be a good thing, in that there's renewed interest and some embarrassment at least on UK's relationship with Bahrain. A cross-party group tried, I think, or is trying to get access to the women detainees in Saudi. But anyway, yeah, the UK is even more dreadful than the US, although I guess there is some realistic proposition of there being a new government in the UK in a way that there really isn't in the US in the next year or two.
The UK, though, they've spent millions of pounds working with Bahrain to try and improve the human rights in Bahrain. And if we haven't seen anything move forward, is there anything else outside of public opinion or our work that can hold them accountable to that? Do they not feel like...
Can hold the UK accountable?
Yeah, like...
I mean, perhaps the issue just hasn't risen to sufficient salience in British public opinion. I'm really not an expert on the domestic politics of Britain, so I probably shouldn't delve into this too much, but yeah, it seems that there's a gap between what could, oh, we've got a Brit here. I bet he's got an insight.
Yeah, great. Okay.
Just really quickly, Annie, just to say that before the election and indeed after the election, Salon for Democracy and Human Rights has asked the SCO categorically for a meeting, and we've been fobbed off. A couple times it's been the teams in turmoil, there's the staff change and so on. But requests to meet with Alistair Burt, who's the relevant minister, have been kicked into the long grass. I think what Joe said is spot on, and indeed what Devon has just said, and Brian as well, in respect to there not having been any sort of high-profile event vis-a-vis public opinion. We've not undertaken it. I mean, I'd very much like to see somebody dressed in a Bahraini police uniform make an arrest, a symbolic arrest of 5 people gathering outside of Parliament, get media to cover it, because 5 or more people, according to the Penal Code 178, 5 or more people gathering in a public place is illegal. So let's have somebody with a Bahraini uniform arrest, quote unquote, arrest somebody in front of Parliament. Just something to get British public opinion engaged in a very febrile atmosphere that we have in the UK now.
Thank you. Yes, you have a point. Yes. Okay.
So just a quick comment on Joe and Brian here about the British politics towards Bahrain. It's been usual when they speak about Bahrain, they said we are talking to Bahraini government privately, and they usually use the soft language with Bahrain. And there's a lot of reasons behind this, and they said we are sharing history and culture and stuff. I mean, something here probably new, like Bahrain now, they're hoping to see Labour Party leading the government, and this might have a big change versus the Conservative government. Just to go back to what Aya mentioned also here about the Swiss position, the human rights. We learned Bahraini government, it's not the government, it's the king himself. He met with the high officials from Swiss governments about that statement, which we have seen a couple of sessions in the Human Rights Councils, and now they are absent. The reason behind this, they said we are going to give Bahrain more time to revise their attitude towards human rights defenders and politicians, and let's give them more chance to review their attitude. But meanwhile, Bahrain being elected twice in the human rights consultative chambers, which is against everything. We knew like who's behind this. The Arab group in the Human Rights Council also behind this, and especially Saudi Arabia is supporting. Now, why did mention like any hearing in the House of Bahrain and Saudis? The reason behind this, I did ask this question to the Foreign Affairs Committee, and they said the reason behind this is Saudis financing Bahrain. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Okay, one more question, because people were talking about it earlier, getting access for special rapporteurs. How do you see that happening? Is there a way that could actually come to fruition? What could people be doing, working on to make that happen?
I mean, sorry, go ahead if you like.
It's a tough question. It's hard to know what kind of leverage other states have on Bahrain. So not every, but at least the last couple of joint statements have called, from the Human Rights Council, have called on Bahrain to open up an office there for the High Commissioner for Human Rights and have a permanent presence in country, and Bahrain hasn't done that. Other ideas, I mean, recently, and you might know the example better, there were, I think, some British parliamentarians, was it, who wrote a letter to Saudi asking that they be allowed to go visit a female prison to speak with some of the prisoners. I don't know what the response was from Saudi, but that issue generated a lot of pickup in the media. So perhaps letters from the, very public letters from the rapporteurs or from parliamentarians from the EU or Congress, men and women, asking very publicly for access to Bahrain, for visiting Bahrain might make a difference. And what's curious about Bahrain is, I mean, their human rights record is abysmal, but they also do seem to respond to all allegations made against them by organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and the various parliaments. You know, they will never say, we're issuing a statement in response to so-and-so's criticism of us, but they will almost always respond, sometimes on Instagram, which is a bit weird. But, so after the Rajab case, they did respond to the international community's criticism and actually addressed, I mean, you probably don't believe what, the issues, they called him a liar, they called other people terrorists, so obviously we won't take them at face value for how they're responding, but they did respond to almost every single allegation made against them. So I think that there is a lot of pressure that we can bring to bear on Bahrain in very public ways, and I think that maybe that might shift the needle a bit, might shift their calculus, but we just haven't seen a very concerted effort yet by the international community demanding access to Bahrain. So perhaps that's something that we can work on with the new Congress, perhaps that's something that we can work on with the European Parliament. A lot of these, the Irish Parliament as well issued a statement ahead of the elections expressing their concerns. So there are some international actors who have expressed some sort of interest and willingness to work on Bahrain. And I think we need to take that further and call for access for special rapporteurs and for international delegations to visit Bahrain and force Bahrain to respond to these requests.
The special rapporteurs can only go into a country at the invitation of the country. I mean, there's some grey area there where somebody else within the country, university or something, could ask them to go in to give a lecture, but, a special rapporteur isn't supposed to go to a country unless that country has invited them in. But I don't think we necessarily have to be that passive about it. I mean, MPs from other countries, international NGOs can just show up. I went last year with a member of the Danish Parliament to Bahrain, fully expecting not to be allowed in, and we weren't. But it caused a little bit of a fuss, and I wonder if that was happening every week. If a member of parliament from a different country or international NGOs who don't have official permission to go, if you're just showing up at the airport time and time again, that's a lot of pressure on them. And they're going to have to rethink how they're going to be doing that. So we don't just have to wait to be invited or wait for permission. You can't just turn up and put the ball in their court and say, what are you going to do about it?
On the side with commissions that are visiting the country, and there's so many NGOs that aren't even allowed to go in the country. Many people are just blocked the minute they go there. So finding more creative ways of kind of hooking into more, I guess, formalized visits. Mm-hmm. Yeah, great idea. Mm-hmm. Do you have anything else to say on this topic, or?
Those were awfully smart ideas. I like the notion of targeting parliamentarians to push Bahrain on this issue. That's probably a more visible and high-profile way of doing it than through the special rapporteurs, which are more limited by diplomatic protocol. So yeah, I have nothing smarter than they have to add to that.
It's not a test. There will be applause afterwards. Yeah.
I think another thing worth pushing, and we'll see where it goes, is to have governments or even parliaments to instruct their ambassadors to Bahrain to ask formally for permission to visit the human rights defenders in prison. I don't think for a moment that they will be given permission, but to publicly ask for that. I mean, especially those countries where they have asked. I mean, the US is one. The US has said that Nabil and Ali Salman should not be in prison. I think it would be perfectly logical then for the US ambassador to at least say, can I go and see it? We think these guys shouldn't be in prison, but if you're going to keep them in prison, at least I want to go and talk to them. There aren't many embassies actually in Bahrain. Many of them are responsible for Bahrain, but are based in Saudi. But even so, I think it's worth pushing parliamentarians to push ambassadors to try and get access to human rights activists in prison.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important for CSOs, for us to be aware of when these commissions are happening, because sometimes it's not always public information, you know, when they're happening, and for us to find out and try and insert ourselves into those spaces, I think is something we need to continue to do as well. Is there any other piece of advice in terms of moving forward in this particular context, working with international mechanisms from your work that you could share with people in terms of how they want to continue to work in Bahrain?
I guess I'll point out that within the last couple of years, I had a meeting with some of the human rights staff of the UN in Geneva, and my organizational role there was to push them to issue more critical statements of Bahrain, and they said, look, we already issue more statements on Bahrain than we do proportionally to most other countries. So I don't think it's correct to say that the UN has been silent on Bahrain. Its professional human rights bureaucracy, at least if not the Council, has been the opposite of silent. It's been very vocal and very critical. It's been excellent. So it's good to keep that up, but just thinking tactically going forward, we should try and expand on that. Again, maybe the notions of parliaments of allied countries is a smart way to take it, but we've already got the UN in Geneva on our side, essentially, so it's time to move past that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Maya?
I think just continuing to publicize cases. So the case that comes to mind now, and we haven't touched on yet, is Hakim's case. So Hakim Alavi was a Bahraini refugee living in Australia. He went on vacation to Thailand, and the Bahrainis found out and issued an extradition request from Thailand to take him to Bahrain. They counted on it all going according to plan. They counted on there not being international coverage of the issue, and then them quickly taking Hakim back to Bahrain. And this happened a few years ago in the case of another person who was also a Bahraini person who was extradited from Thailand to Bahrain with minimal media coverage. So that's what they were counting on with Hakim's case as well. But international media picked it up, Amnesty worked on it, Human Rights worked on it, Human Rights Watch worked on it. And so the case got a lot of attention in the media, and then it forced Thailand to kind of struggle between either returning Hakim to Bahrain or returning him to Australia, where he's an accepted refugee and permanent resident. And now this tug of war, so to speak, between Bahrain on the one hand and Australia on the other, and Thailand in the middle, is still ongoing. But this was an issue where a lot of media attention, a lot on Twitter, articles and press releases and media appearances by civil society organizations, by international organizations, and by several key embassies did really make a very big difference. Hakim is still now in detention in Thailand, and this kind of struggle is ongoing, but had his case not been highlighted in the media, I think that he would have been extradited to Bahrain the day he stepped foot in Thailand. So I think the onus is on us also to